life actually has evolved as a mechanism to accelerate the heat death of the universe. Electrical charge across the inner membrane of the mitochondria is millions of volts. And, when I say to people, you're walking around millions of these things inside your body with this huge electrical charge across them.
Deprive circadian signals, you deprive near-infrared light, the mitochondrion falls apart and essentially you get accelerated aging. I think that's what's happening now. In this 2-hour deep dive, we explore a radical idea that modern diseases arise because humans are living outside the environmental conditions for which we evolved. We discuss mitochondria, light, magnetism, aging, cancer, and why optimal health may be mostly about staying within this biological Goldilocks zone. Strap in. Speaking with Professor Alistair Nunn, who is the Director of Science at the Guy Foundation, who are dedicated to researching quantum biology and its applications. Alistair has previously been featured on the podcast before in discussion of space health, and he's been very kind to join me again today. Welcome, Alistair.
Thank you, Max. Nice to see you again.
A couple of fundamental inputs into human biology and mitochondrial biology, and there has been 3 recent seminar series that the Guy Foundation has hosted, which has been an absolute wealth of information. And the themes of those, one yet to come, have been light, water, and soon magnetism. Can you explain to us what about those topics are so pertinent or so relevant to what human biology and potentially disease?
I find the best way to approach this, and this is kind of how we've got into this and think about it, is to think through evolution. And it's always this idea, if you understand current biology, you need to think back through evolution. And in particular, if we can, although it's a bit of a dark art, think about the origins of life. And the way I do it, and I think I'm not the only person who does this, is to think, well, okay, life evolved on this planet. And what were the conditions it evolved in? And the perhaps best way of describing this is that life evolved to work in a certain particular way. And today it lives in a Goldilocks zone of requirements and factors. We can't breathe in space. We can't breathe, humans can't breathe underwater. But our environment has been, we evolved under 1G of gravity. We think life started potentially with magnetic fields, but we don't know. But certainly in the last millions of years, life has been under the exposure to the Earth's geomagnetic field. Now, that does vary and it does reverse sometimes. But the other thing it's been evolved under is light. And there, again, we're not entirely sure because on the early Earth things varied. But certainly we know that we've evolved, and certainly in the last millions of years, under sunlight. And I think that's the key thing we got, certainly for humans, we've got to take into account. And there's very good evidence now that changes in magnetic fields can affect biology. And secondly, it seems that we also can be affected by light. And I think most of you will know this. If you stand outside in Australia in midsummer, you'll get cooked and not be very well. But equally, if we go out to the Antarctic or Arctic in the winter, you spend 2 or 3 months with no sunlight at all. And then neither of those circumstances do we do particularly well unless we have help. And so we really just view this as saying, well, actually, life and certainly humans evolved to work under a set of circumstances. And if you take humans outside of those circumstances, they start not to function terribly well. And I think everybody kind of knows that anyway. And certainly as we on the previous podcast, we're talking about space. And certainly when we look into how humans might do in space, the environment out there is utterly alien to what we evolved in. And we require a lot of technology just to keep us alive, let alone living in optimal health. And this is, I think, something Max and I discussed before about optimal health. What actually is health? And so this is our interest in realizing that actually we require a set of conditions to function at our best. Take those conditions away and we don't function quite as well. I think so. This is very much an evolutionary origins of life approach to how we should function now. And indeed, that will define how we measure health and indeed correct things that go wrong.
Does that
kind of make sense? Yeah.
absolutely?
Yeah.
We're going to pick this apart bit by bit, but
Yeah.
why don't you give me and give us your best understanding of what the conditions were that facilitated the origin of life?
Million dollar question. There's the ideas that are already out there, and then the ideas that I might have, and mostly they're similar. And of course, any scientist or anybody actually don't have to be a scientist will look at all the data that's available, and indeed look at the thinking that's already available. And this is how humans have progressed over thousands and thousands of years. There are often a few very bright individuals who, going back thousands of years, worked out how to do something. But in our modern age, of course, we're now surrounded by huge amounts of information. And I guess the ticket is to start looking at all that information and working out, what's actually real and what isn't. And so from that perspective, when I sort of was a young scientist, I didn't really think about all of this. But when we started in the last 15 years, really casting around and saying, actually, biology is, and even chemistry is quite siloed, and physics is quite siloed. And I was very lucky to get the opportunity to start to think and look at a lot of literature right across multiple disciplines. And this is not always that easy in science, simply because it's very difficult to work outside your own field because you just don't get funding. So the ability to look at generally right across the board has been really important. And this has enabled me to look into the origins of life, the current theories, there are multiple different theories, to look at how that might apply, for instance, to exoplanetary intelligence and exoplanetary life, life beyond Earth. I was always interested in the science fiction. Then we can start to look at that from the physics perspective. And this is something which I think quantum biology is about, is beginning to understand how we look at biology from the physics. And of course, this goes right back to the origins of life. And how can I put it? One of the best explanations, I think, at the moment in the literature is that life very likely, we don't know, but very likely started perhaps in thermal vents. Now, this isn't the only theory. There are plenty of other theories. But what makes this particularly strong is, I think, one of the strongest mathematical proofs related to thermodynamics is that life actually can be viewed as a system. It's a natural product of the physics and the maths and in thermodynamics, that if you have an energy gradient, so for instance, you've got a hot thermal vent and a cold sea, or you've got the sun and the shade, there's this energy potential. And theory goes that this, if you have matter in there, just molecules and things, they seem to have the tendency to self-organize. And this goes back to theories by Ilya Prigogine, that matter will actually self-organize to accelerate the dissipation of that energy potential. And the real sort of, this is the kind of really deep thinking here, and is that life actually has evolved as a mechanism to accelerate the heat death of the universe. Now, that's very profound, but actually, far as I can see, there's still one of the best theories out there about life, how it actually started. Now, of course, there's a lot of details we need to fill in. But the reason for this is now we start to look through the universe, and this is perhaps something which wasn't fully appreciated not that long ago. We will all have learned that life requires water. And you would have seen in science fiction books and science fiction, well, can it be silicon based or something else based? But actually, water turns out to be very, very ancient, and it could have been around right at the cosmic dawn. And it's also turning out to be really important in how planetary systems and solar systems evolve. So water plays a much bigger role in how everything develops in our physical universe. And the really interesting thing here, of course, is that when we start to look at water, we also start to look at basic chemistry. And one of the things, again, with the James Webb and these newer instruments are coming online now, we're beginning to look into the universe and discovering that what we would call organic molecules, i.e. carbon-based molecules, the universe is full of them. And there seems to be some very good chemistry, interesting chemistry going on in solar, in dust clouds and on other planets, which is generating all the soup ingredients for life. Now, whether they self-organize is the different question. And, you would have heard about Bennu and the fact that they've, brought samples back from an asteroid. And not only does it contain water, it contains brine, so salty water, but it also contains amino acids and other aromatic compounds. And you think, okay, so these have all come from space, nothing to do with the planet. Well, nothing to do with the planet, but a lot of that chemistry also goes on on our planet, our own geochemistry. And it's been said that by it was Morovitz and Smith, some very famous people who studied geochemistry, that life just basically is an emergent property of the planet. But of course, when you start to look at all these other chemicals, and what we're based on, you go, okay, so the soup was already there. The ingredients, you'd be like, of the ingredients for life was already out there, maybe on Earth, maybe elsewhere. But what it requires is something to organize it. And that could well be this idea of self-organization and dissipation. And this is why thermal vents become really interesting. And again, there'll be groups who say, no, it must have evolved and say like a hot spring on the surface of the Earth. That's nothing wrong with that. It may have required dry cycling, so you had big polymers like the early versions of DNA or other big molecules, but they could only form when it all dried out. So there's all these various ideas going forward. But one of the interesting ones, and this is something which is becoming apparent now, is that the other ingredient which was required was UV light. Now, because UV has has a high energy light, and it can sort of ionize things, but it seems to drive a lot of the chemistry, certainly in interstellar space, but also on the Earth. And one of the theories, again, there are other theories are available, is that on the early Earth, because there wasn't much oxygen and the younger sun, UV levels were very high, much higher than they are today, and they reached the ground. And of course, this would have meant that no biological molecule would last for very long on the surface of the Earth. And this has led to theories that life, therefore, just couldn't have started on the surface of the Earth, but must have started deeper in the planet. And if you start to put these ideas together, you have some quite, and again, this is perhaps more my personal thinking on this, is of course, if the thermal vent theory is right, then that's actually not a bad place for life to get going, because it's hot. Thermal vents produce light. You've heard about these, they call them the smokers and things, but they've got water coming up from subduction plates at 300, 400, 500 degrees C. And there's some very good, very well established chemistry going on there. So you've got the heat, these things, because they're hot, they're glowing, in the infrared in particular, but then you can pick them out. So you've got a lot of the ingredients already there. You've got some light, you've got photons, you've got heat, and you've got a big energy potential between the cold sea and the hot thermal vent. And you've got all the other things like aromatic amino acids, aromatic compounds and things. So actually start to put those things together, you go, okay, well, there is a place where it could have started. Now, if that's true, and again, we've got again, other theories are available, it would suggest then as life got going, these fundamental characteristics would have been carried forward as evolution got more and more complex. And one of the ways, and this is how I look at this, is a very old idea. If you go back a couple of hundred years, people were talking about electricity. Galvani and his frog's legs. Everybody think, oh, that's really, okay. But there's also Volta, who was looking at batteries and things. And there was actually a discussion going on, a couple hundred years ago about whether electricity was biological or physical. So nothing new there. But this led, certainly as we came into the 19th century, that and before we knew anything about DNA, that life actually was electrical. And one of the things that determined its shape was what they call a morphogenetic field. And not everybody would have heard of this, but of course, when you start thinking about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, that period, everybody was thinking about electricity, reanimation. This was all something, so not new, but what they were onto was something really fundamental. And this was even before folk had discovered the basic, basic biochemistry. Was that a lot of the compounds involved in this process also absorb light. Now, this was really they called cytochromes, and you probably might have heard of this. Is a bit more biochemical, but these are compounds. They called a cytochrome. Simply, it's a molecule in a cell which is coloured. That's all it means. But as it turned out, these compounds are essential for life, and one of their key roles is in channeling electrons, which brings us back to electricity and brings us back to the thermal vent, because life is fundamentally all about flowing electrons, certainly for humans, flowing electrons from food down to oxygen. Now, it can do it without oxygen, and there are plenty of other organisms which don't require oxygen, but there has to be this ability to flow electrons from one place to another. And of course, that makes us purely electrical, and which brings us back to the thermal vent again. Now, one of the because I think this leads into something which is interesting in mitochondria, of course. This leads us into this really interesting observation, which is why the thermal vent theory is so strong. Is of course one of the fundamental particles flowing was of course protons, nucleus of a hydrogen. And if you have hydrogen and you have carbon dioxide and you've got electrons, you've got the very basis of how to make carbon-based molecules. And this is, of course, this is why the thermal vent theory is quite strong. Throw in self-organization, you have all these things going together. And so what we seem to have is a mix of fundamental chemistry, which doesn't require life, which can be used potentially to go into life, to make life, which contains these fundamental molecules. Now, other molecules, which are also essential, and this comes back to the same thing, are these iron-sulfur compounds. And of course, the world is full of iron. Iron is a very common element. But it's these iron-sulfur compounds. They have some very interesting quantum properties, and they're essential again in how you channel electrons. And if we then start to throw in something else here, which is magnetism, you start to think, well, hang on. If we think about the flow of electrons, we also have to think about quantum mechanical principles like spin and what we call coherence and all sorts of other things, which are affected by magnetic fields. So this is another factor which may have been important at the origins of life. How much we don't know. We don't even know if the Earth had a proper magnetic field at the beginning, because it might not. We don't know. We simply do not know. Because the evidence, if you go back to about 3.5 billion years, because the way we know this is we look at the strata and rocks and things, but beyond a certain time, because the Earth formed, 4.5 billion years ago, 4.8 billion years ago, and it was all liquid rock, But what we do know is as soon as it cooled, life started very quickly. So that's a really interesting fact. So when you put all these things together, you go, right, okay, well, we had the chemistry, we had these biotic molecules, we've got these compounds which are very sensitive to magnetic fields. We've got a big flow of electrons. We've discussed this before, because if you're flowing electrons and flowing protons, you have electrical fields. And so this is the other big, I always like to, if I give a lecture, I always talk about the yin yang. And well, actually, there's a triple, you can use a triple yin yang too, but I'll just stick the simpler one, which of course, biology and medicine largely to date has talked about molecules. You'll see in all textbooks, there's the 3D structures and the ball and stick structures. But of course, all of that is held together and interacts through fields. And the very famous point made by Nick Lane is that if you look into a mitochondria, the electrical charge across the membrane, if it's scaled up across the inner membrane of the mitochondria, is millions of volts. And when I say to people, you're walking around millions of these things inside your body with this huge electrical charge across them, and that is generated, which is largely generating due to a proton gradient, like a hydrogen nucleus gradient, and that drives all these little turbines called ATPAs. Suddenly you go from this very sort of, well, life's like this, to suddenly, gosh, we have to think about all these fields, how these protons are flowing, how the electrons are flowing, what's controlling all of this process. And then you come to the conclusion that life, therefore, is a structure which relies on the dissipation of these and movement of these various fundamental particles to exist. Now, if we take that back to its simplest, it means in you and I, we're full of these things. And then you go right back through history and back to the early life. That's how it probably started. So the big question, of course, is, and this is my personal interest, is what was the role of light in all of this? Because, of course, quantum mechanics is one of the strongest or the best theories we've got at the moment. It seems to work. The truth is we don't fully understand what it is. We still, when people say, oh, we've sorted science out, no, we've got a long way to go. And certainly the understanding what quantum mechanics actually represents is still very much a huge area of research. But we can describe it and it works. And all of us are sitting here. I'm talking to you guys through a system which relies on quantum tunneling. We look at computers and things like that. So it's there. So the quantum biology question is biology must be using these things, this principle somewhere along the line. So when we start to look at modern medicine, of course, we go, well, we're looking at humans who are vastly complex, but of course, you go back through time, we're based on something much, much simpler. And so understanding that eventually will give us an idea of, what actually we mean by aging and health. And I think we still don't fully understand that. But again, this is where the maths may come into it. The self-organization idea if you link it to natural selection, suggests that that if we look at life at the global level on the planet, now by that I mean, we're very used to looking at individual species on, and this species dies out and this one comes along. But if you actually take some of the natural selection idea, natural selection is operating all the way from the molecular, and we believe all the way up to the level of species, because it is a process which has come out from a physics basis to dissipate energy potentials. And it kind of suggests, and if you take it right to its extreme, and this is something we've suggested in a paper, this means that life, every single form of life, is an experiment in progress to adapt to a changing environment. And with this, Darwin touched on this certainly. But if we look at, for instance, what happened to the dinosaurs, we think what happened was this: a meteorite or a really large asteroid hit the Earth, and it reset the whole thing. What survived? Those creatures and organisms which could adapt very quickly. That usually meant they had to adapt very quickly through natural selection of species. So, a lot of them died out, but the more ones which are better suited survived. But of course, we now know that in the human body, this process is going on all the time. I mean, as Max will fully understand, that the immune system works by this principle. It's a naturally selective process. When you get exposed to a new virus or a new bacterium or something, your body doesn't have it might not have a memory of meeting anything like that before. But what it does is produce millions of variations of antibodies just completely randomly until one of them sticks. And that process then naturally selects. And so that process is definitely going on. We know that, for instance, and this is another big step in biology, which I was lucky enough to work on many years ago, is this process called apoptosis, which is, of course, programmed cell death. And for years, up until the 1970s, we didn't really know how we adapted to changes, in particular in infections and things. Because what we now know is that every day, millions, billions of your cells are dying. They're dying for the greater good, and they're being naturally selected all the time. And this process is going on all the time. Now, if you expand that downwards to molecules, we know at the molecular level, this is happening all the time. One of the key processes in your body is making new proteins, and they don't always work. They have some very complex problems to solve. It's like multi-dimensional origami. And if they don't fold properly, they get removed. And that's natural selection. Those that don't work are removed. And that scales up from down to even smaller molecules. But of course, it goes into your organelles and your cells, like mitochondria to your cells, we said. And it was said many years ago, of course, the same process could be happening to species at an organism level. And this is, again, quite controversial because, of course, without venturing into what aging is, and of course, there's been this long-term discussion going on in biology for hundreds of years. Is aging just a natural stochastic process where things just wear out and we just shuffle off the mortal coil? Or is it actually adaptive? And I can be controversial here, but if you think about the thermodynamic principles, it could be adaptive. Because if you've got old things which don't work very well, you don't want them around because they can damage everything else. And there are some theories in maths which suggest that when you look at this self-organization process, indeed systems have evolved to remove duff units, as it were. And this was the thing about apoptosis. Of course, nobody believed that why would cells commit suicide? They always want to live. No, they've been programmed to die. And what's fascinating is, of course, this process seems to have evolved very early in evolution. And it was only sort of 15 years ago we began to realize that bacteria commit suicide for the greater good. And that begins to go, oh, hang on, programmed cell death or cell suicide probably evolved very early on. And what's particularly interesting, of course, the flip side to this is it suggests that cooperation, rather than every organism for itself, actually is the way to go. And certainly when we look back through time and we look at these I can't remember what they're called, these colonies of fossilized colonies of bacteria, stromatolites, that's what they're called. They are very ancient and they were cooperating. And we're now seeing when we look into bacterial colonies, and indeed inside you and I, we're full of microbiota, and we've got a whole spread of bacteria and things called archaea, which we'll come on to, which are all cooperating. And this process may be very, very ancient indeed. And so, but you can see how this all begins to make sense. And if this is linked together, it does suggest that certainly for most species, aging is actually adaptive, i.e. we are programmed to die beyond a certain point. And that has profound implications for everything, of course, including space travel. If there's this idea that if we humans do age in space, we can genetically adapt them to live longer. Now, that is a real goal. I attended a meeting last night. They've just launched a new foundation called Chabadi in Pittsburgh, and one of the processes here is to use space to model accelerated aging. And if this is true, then there's a lot we can learn from this. But at the moment, we still don't fully understand what the aging process is and how we can manipulate. Of course, it's the golden, it's the $1 billion question: can we slow the aging process down? And if it is adaptive, then potentially we can. And I mean, I'm saying it here. I don't think we know how to do it yet, but it's definitely there. And as we've discussed before, health is perhaps something we can modify ourselves. So really, if we go back to the origins of life, we can start to move forward into understanding aging and potentially how to control it and what modern disease is. But it suggests that all things need to be taken on board, and that includes light, magnetic fields, and the other big one, of course, is gravity. And we haven't even touched on that one. But of course, gravity seems to be really, really important, certainly for our forms of life. Now, whether life doesn't evolve in areas without gravity, there's no reason why it probably couldn't. But for humans, it's very essential. And this is one of the things that we now realize, certainly for astronauts, it has a devastating effect on their metabolism. And one of the things which probably kind of leads us very neatly into, I think, one of the questions you wanted to ask about mitochondria, was, of course, we know that in space, your mitochondria, they become very dysfunctional very quickly. And of course, their origins are very interesting too. But it makes the point that even the mitochondria are just not adapting properly to the space environment. And one of the reasons for this, and this comes back to this idea of the Goldilocks zone, is that, as we've discussed before, one of the key problems in a modern environment, which and certainly those of you who understand what the metabolic syndrome is, we're seeing increasing levels of obesity, accelerated aging in people, getting diseases much at early ages like diabetes and cardiovascular disease and even cancer. And this seems to be largely due to humans living in an environment which is not the one they evolved in. So we have lots of comfortable, lovely food. We don't move around, and as we may discuss, we also live in potentially the wrong light environment as well, which could be having an impact. And that seems to accelerate the aging process. But one of the fundamental things that links a lot of this is mitochondrial dysfunction. And in space, we've sorry, as a plug here, sorry, Mac, but we've just published a paper in Nature where we're talking at Nature Microgravity, where we suggested that one of the problems in space is that lack of gravity removes the driver for mitochondrial reserve. And this is something which, if it's real, which it seems to be, because one of the things we know on Earth is if we exercise, it's good for us. And we know that one of the things that does is it's anti-inflammatory generally, but secondly, it stimulates an increase in what we call the mitochondrial reserve. And that gives us robustness, and it seems to give us robustness against many other diseases too, which is why exercise seems to be important. But in space, of course, without gravity, it's very difficult to maintain that stimulus. Now, all astronauts exercise a lot on the ISS, and it's one of the best things they can do. Of course, there's a big question whether we can ever do it enough to maintain a healthy metabolism. So we evolved in this Goldilocks zone requiring certain stimuli, and exercise is one of them. And of course, what we now know, if we look at the light thing too, whether that's also important as well in maintaining mitochondrial function. So I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but the mitochondrial story, of course, is, and I think you wanted to ask that, Max, is of course that how did modern cells come along? And I guess I think most people now know that somewhere 1 to 2 billion years ago, maybe even earlier, two fundamental kingdoms of life, which had been around a long time, what we call prokaryotes. And a prokaryote simply means an organism without a nucleus. And that term may even come into question soon. But there was these things called the archaea, and there was these things called the bacteria. And we all know about bacteria. Everybody's heard about bacteria. But of course, there's a mirror kingdom of things called archaea, which are similar, but they're actually quite different in many ways. And the thinking is that billions of years ago, an archaean engulfed a bacterium, and that bacterium became the mitochondria. And a lot of evidence this is the correct thing to do. What's becoming increasingly fascinating is, of course, there's still very big holes in how this happened. But the archaea are turning out to be absolutely fascinating, far more so than we ever realized, because we're now discovering various species of these archaea, and they seem to have immensely complex structures which we never thought were possible in prokaryotes, including the ability to have move their membranes around. So slightly more amoeboid, if you like to do the term, but they don't really have a nucleus as such. But they also have a cytoskeleton. Now, if this is true, these things could be truly ancient, and these things could have been around for 3 billion years. So when did they evolve? So, of course, we're starting to unlock some of the secrets of what's going on. But, of course, for modern humans, certainly, mitochondria, because of this engulfment, they become absolutely endosymbiotic with our cells, which means that mitochondria in particular are very sensitive markers of what goes on in a cell. And you'll see in the literature, everybody says, well, mitochondria, they're like the batteries in a cell. Well, kind of, but actually they're involved in everything. They control your immune system. They control how your calcium flows through the cell. They control how you respond to stress. And of course, they also manage how you grow and die. So this is a very ancient thing, and understanding why they do this is really interesting, which of course brings us back to magnetic fields and electron transport. There, where a lot of the electron transport, how the electrons move around, and the wires that move those systems around are sensitive to magnetic fields. And there's, one of the things that we've got very interested in is if we go into space, you're going to be exposed beyond the Earth's geomagnetic sphere, so into orbit around the moon or part of the moon, and certainly out to interplanetary space, you're exposed to a very, very low magnetic field. And so around the Earth, it's measured as around 60, 50, what they call microtesla. That's where we evolved. In the ISS, it's about 20 or 30 microtesla, but beyond the moon, it's down to nanotesla. And there's now a lot of evidence, and we're looking at this too, that if you put organisms into a field which is less than the Earth's magnetic field, they start to show signs of stress. So it appears that the certainly, again, we need to investigate a bit more, but certainly the movement of electrons in our bodies is sensitive to the magnetic field, which quantum mechanics would predict. So this is one of the strongest, pieces of evidence, and which I think you're going to want to talk about in our next series. But of course, this does suggest that indeed changing the magnetic field will have an effect. And if you think about the system being electrical and therefore quantum mechanical, this is fairly obvious that it's going to happen. The effect might be quite small, but it's nevertheless there. So I don't know if that brings us back to kind of where you want to go. So it's a roundabout way of the origins of life back to the health. So does that make sense?
There's a lot there. I want to ask you about something you said very early on, which was biology accelerating the heat death of the universe. I really need you to expand upon that point before we continue to go forward.
Well, I'm not. I'm a biologist or biochemist. I'm not a mathematician, and I'm certainly not a physicist. But this is again reading around the subject. But of this idea that in thermodynamics and entropy, the nature abhors the potential. It doesn't like having hot things. It doesn't like having, it wants everything to become equilibrated. I'm trying to, it's a difficult word to get out. And from that, if this idea of the self-organization is correct, then you could argue that life is a natural product of that system to use that energy up, as it were, turn it from high energy into low energy. And, and it's been said several times that life just dissipates the solar potential, i.e. you've got these high energy photons coming in from the sun, they hit Earth, this process of self-organization happens, and then they convert that. Plants first convert it into molecules and, the building complexes. So they take some of the energy. If you look at a plant, it's dissipating solar potential. And one of the ways it does that, it releases a bit of heat, but it builds things. And in the process of building things, that increases, it dissipates energy. And then, of course, animals like us come along, eat them, and dissipate that energy even further. And so you can see how that whole process goes on. But of course, there's, we start getting into some interesting realms of science fiction here, because, but is it science fiction? Because, of course, if we look back through history, the average human could burn through an average human's worth of energy during its lifetime, during our lifetime. Then we discovered horses. So we got into horsepower. That used more energy. Then we started building stuff that used even more energy. And if you look at this in a sort of a global, the galactic scale, we're now developing technologies where we can unleash huge amounts of power, dissipating energy. Look at how much oil we're now burning. Look at how much, we're developing techniques to go straight to the mother lode of fusion and fission, which releases energy, energy and matter into convertible. And this kind of makes a really interesting point, that is intelligence a natural product of the same process? And the argument can be made that intelligence is simply a way of doing this. That one of the big problems we got at the moment is defining what life is, and indeed what intelligence. Well, intelligence is kind of a very broad scale. It just means adaptation and taking on information. But the really big question, and this is something which I don't know if we want to go into completely today, is self-awareness. And of course, one of the ways of defining that is a system which has an internal system and an external system. It needs to constantly understand the difference between the external environment and the internal environment. And that's what life does. And it does it from very small levels. Bacteria do it very well. They're very adaptable. So they're taking on information. Of course, this has very big implications about what we actually mean by information. And this again is a concept which has been around for a long time. Is information something more solid than we realize? But so you're talking about the heat death of the universe. The Stephen Hawkins and others and have talked about this. Is that if we look at the way the universe evolves, the stars come and go, but as they get older and older and older, the energy in the universe slowly equilibrates and dissipates. And so it goes from being, you start off with like if the Big Bang was correct, this super hot thing with lots of energy in one place, but slowly the energy dissipates, and in photonic terms, it becomes, the wavelengths get longer and longer and longer and longer until the energy, no work can be done anymore, and therefore life ceases to exist and matter ceases to exist. I mean, it happens. The prediction is it could happen trillions of years in the future. But that seems to be coming out of the basic laws of thermodynamics and even probably quantum mechanics. It's quite a depressing thing to think. But if that's true, you could see that from that little wrinkle, that life just falls out of this self-organization process. And the point I make about that, a very good example of this in a non-biological way, is what's happening now on the planet. And, we all know about hurricanes and storms and things. And certainly in the UK, we've had a whole series of named storms hitting us. And we've got another one coming tomorrow. And then people talk about this as global warming. But what that is simply that the system is self-organizing to dissipate the energy in the atmosphere. And so you've got lots of hot water, damp water, and that dissipates the energy as a storm. And every time that happens, it just makes the universe a little bit more disorganized. And that process just carries on and on and on. So there's fundamental principles at work here, which can be applied to biology, but we see all around us. A star is the same thing. The sun is the same thing. It's a self-dissipating system. Our sun, fortunately, should last us, several more billion years, but some stars only last millions of years, the super blue giants, because they're balancing fusion forces and energy production, but they're changing hot energy into, energy can't be destroyed, but you can see the principle going from hot to cold. And therefore, life is perhaps just the same thing. Now, the question is, how much of influence do we have? At the moment, it's not much. But if you believe some people, and there's this idea of the Kardashev, Kardashev made this point about, if you look at various civilizations, and Carl Sagan talked about this, if we're looking for life beyond us, what levels of civilization can it achieve? Well, we've gone from using the horse, we've now gone to the nuclear age. Potentially, we could be going into, if we survive, and using physics we still don't understand, could we harness more of the sun? But every time we use that energy to create something, we increase that. We increase the dissipation of that energy, and eventually you could argue that civilizations control whole stars. But all that's doing is accelerating the death of that star. So this is what we mean by the heat death of the universe. Now, I'm sure there'll be physicists who will go, "Oh, he's talking rubbish," but certainly, if they're looking at the maths and the physics behind it, it does seem to make some sense. And if we're correct on this, biology is just an example of this. Philosophically, it's a really difficult question because, of course, it changes how you view things. We're just a product of physics. I believe that.
Fascinating. I want to go to essentially prokaryotic evolution, as you were discussing, and a question that popped into my mind in your description of but maybe around endosymbiosis is, if mitochondrial physiology involves this extremely intricate, evolved process of electron tunneling that culminates in this incredibly, what, maybe 99.9% efficient nanomotor that spins a rotor to generate ATP. What was the archaea's mechanism of essentially metabolizing if it were different to?
No, it's not. This is good question. All life contains an electron transport chain and contains the ATPase. So these things predate; they go back a long way. And this is the other piece of discovery they're trying to do. Is that it's a very good question. What is the oldest molecule? And one of the strongest candidates is actually an ion channel, and which allows flow of ions from differentiates ions. And of course, one of the theories that is in a thermal vent, you had this flow of hydrogen, and biology started there, and it harnessed that hydrogen to create matter, i.e., cells. And that was great, worked fine. Then something changed. Now, this is where natural selection comes in. And then the thinking here is that you have these subduction plates, you've got plate tectonics and these volcanoes, and the hot water all arises along these zones. But subduction tells you what's going on. These plates are slowly moving. So if life did start in one of these places, the thermal vent or whatever was there would slowly move away from it, and it would cool down. And this would generate natural selective processes. And this is why the mitochondrial theory, Nick Lane and Martin and Russell and others make this point, is that the extant life, i.e., life we see now, echoes its beginnings. And this is, to me, one of the stronger theories here about this is that the proton gradient, which I think most of us heard of, if you think about it, it's fundamental particle, hydrogen nucleus, being pumped across using energy from electrons to pump across a membrane. But in the very beginning, the process was completely the other way around. That the basically the protons were generating, or they were harnessing energy, perhaps through certain times of what we call ion channels, to generate matter and cells. So in the beginning, and this is the point where we have to, and I think this is where biology sometimes doesn't always get it right, I think. And there's nothing wrong with this, because it's just the way we thought at the time. But we all talk about biology as being very efficient, and you even use the term with ATPase. They're not. If the dissipated theory is correct, what you want is self-organization structure, dissipating energy. And if you think about it in the early life, if the proton gradient was driving structure, it would have been very inefficient in terms of harnessing energy. But that doesn't matter, because it created structure which accelerated the dissipation of energy. At some point, and how this happened is there's lots of papers discussing how it might have happened. These organisms started being selected, and some of them didn't realize, but they were selected to reverse the process. So they could say, okay, well, can we get another source of energy, say electrons from somewhere else? And then they went, okay, well, we'll generate our own proton gradient. So it's like a snail building a house. It then developed its own house so it could move around. And so at some point, we went from using protons to generate material just as a very inefficient way, because there's a huge energy source. Loads of protons were being generated, and it didn't really matter. But when efficiency to survive came in and natural selection came in, this process had to start to reverse, and we ended up going the other way around. And these little independent units, which could use electrons from other sources to generate their own carry around proton gradient, which is what we see now. And when you look at that process, it's not efficient. Well, in biological terms, it's not efficient, because you're constantly, every single cell in your body, and I think this defines what we know as life, is this process is constantly pumping ions through a membrane all the time. But the key thing is there is what we call it uncoupling, but there's a process which allows the flow of these things back through the membrane, so the thing can cycle. It's like your engine ticking over in a car. It's constantly having to run. And the key thing about that is of course it enables it to be adaptive, but it also means that it has a way of determining inside from outside. So this comes back to self-awareness again. So this constant movement of ions and electrons and protons is what defines life. And we carry around that inside of all of us. But what we do know is this, what we call uncoupling. Mitochondria do it all the time, is that they're only about, most of the time, 80-70% efficient. And one of the interesting things is, of course, is that if you're, for instance, if a mitochondrion is stressed or when you start to get inflammation, one of the things it can do is dissipate even more some of this energy. And the reason for that is if it generates too much of a membrane potential, it generates free radicals. And I think we all know about mitochondria generating ROS. And that the uncoupling process can slow that process down. Go too far the other way, and it generates ROS again. There's some good theories on why that happens. So this whole thing is running at this steady state and its optimal level, burning through energy just to maintain a structure. And of course, back to what I said before, there is clearly a physical structure there, which we all see, look down a microscope and see it. But of course, this is generating huge electric fields. And if we start to think about this idea of bioelectricity, which I think we've talked about before, the idea is that life is electrical, I think is very, very true. And people like Mike Levine are investigating this idea of bioelectricity. And what they seem to be showing is that if we think about this bioelectricity holds information. And we now know that, for instance, if you cut yourself, there's a massive change in electrical profiling around the wound. Bioelectricity changes, and this drives how you heal. So there's information being held in this. And we published a few years ago, an idea that this bioelectricity could actually be the original template of memory. Now, if you think about it back to your thermal vent, if that's where life evolved, the movement of charge would have created a field containing information. And that information could have been under natural selection, which brings us all the way back to this idea of the mitochondria. So, and the key in prokaryotes is you think, okay, did a bacterium have its own mitochondria? No, it was the charge. So if you look at any prokaryote, it has a massive charge across its own membrane, and that's how it functions. It's got ions flowing in and out. It's got this electric field around it, and that's how it helps it sense its environment. And so when you look at antibiotics, what do? You punch holes in that membrane, and it just short circuits the system, and it dies. Archaea are no different. They have these gradients. Every piece of life we see has this gradient. Now, what's interesting is that you'll see people talking about tardigrades. You've probably heard about these little things that seem to be virtually immortal, but they're only immortal like killifish when they're in hibernation, because there's very little movement of stuff. As soon as it starts to move around, it becomes very susceptible to radiation and everything else. And this is the idea, for instance, behind astronauts hibernating, which is actually probably not a bad idea, because we then become much more resistant to radiation. Well, the radiation doesn't do much to us because there's nothing moving around which can get damaged. So that's kind of how that works. But this electric field idea is still very powerful. So it's integrated into this. So back to the Archaean, we think there's ideas that what we're still not entirely sure of was, did life, for instance, start all over the place? And so there's multiple points where it started across the various oceans or wherever it started. And did it lead to two separate kingdoms of life, the Archaean and the bacterium? Or was there one, what they call last universal common ancestor, which was the most primitive form of life we know, and then that started to evolve into two different kingdoms of life? We don't know. The answer is we don't know. But what we do know, they exist, and they are very old, but they use mechanisms to survive. So yeah, that electric field is common.
And perhaps they're using a different terminal electron acceptor instead of oxygen.
Oh yeah. Well, this is the really interesting. Oh yes, they do. Yeah, they can use metals. Where do you think rust comes from? Anything that can accept an electron can be used by life, and indeed they do. They're finding them all over the place. And this is one of the things that with the Archaean is turning out to be really interesting, because they're apparently very difficult to grow. A lot of bacteria are actually very difficult to grow. But they're finding them in very deep sea, in the sediments and deep in the sea, where there's very little oxygen, or there's a very big gradient of oxygen. And what you're seeing, and this is really fascinating again, is you're seeing this immense cooperative of multiple species of both archaea and bacteria living in the sediment, and they share electrons. So the ones deeper down don't have oxygen, but the ones near the top can, so they can flow electrons from one to the other. And this suggests, and these things they're electrical wires, and they contain cytochromes. And so there's this whole bunch of biology going on we're only just discovering. And this is the point I was making earlier about the stromatolites. They weren't just one species of organism, there were multiple species. And if this is correct, because then you can begin to see how some of this would work, because you'd have this transfer of electrons from whatever can accept them, from whatever food you happen to be eating at the time, which then creates life, and it's all energy. And we're finding bacteria and I'm presuming archaea deep in the Earth's mantle. But they take 50 years to replicate because there's so little energy, but they're there and they're living and they're living. They're using completely different forms of chemistry. And well, the fundamental electron transfer is going on. They're just using different molecules. And so, we use oxygen because it's one of the best things to use because we can produce huge amounts of energy. You and I are sitting here burning through 20-30% in our brain. It's hugely expensive, but obviously it's actually a very good way to survive. That's what we do. So the answer is yes. The Archaean would have been using very similar technology, and we don't exactly know when and how was the common one, the same one, a different one, or a different solution to the same problem. Now we see that in the eye evolved, for instance, multiple times in different species, but we think the electron transport chain may have evolved maybe once or twice because it's so ancient, like these ion channels. And ATPase, of course, which is the thing that spins round, is based on an ion channel. So, this is what's so fascinating. Some of these molecules are truly ancient and fundamental to all life.
There's a couple ways I want to go here, and we're going to harp on ancient mitochondrial physiology. What you said about what is occurring in these archaea and the fact that they contain cytochromes, it is implying that the use or the endogenous use of light within mitochondrial coordination and mitochondrial function is equally as ancient. And we're talking about light and its effect on biology, but this is kind of segueing into light is being used in biology as well, perhaps in the form of biophoton emission from mitochondrial electron transport.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually writing a paper at the moment that's trying to address this. But yeah, absolutely right. And the key thing here is and this is I think I've given a lecture on one of the series on this, is that, and we published on this, we're making the point that, and several other people, because Sifra and others have made this point. If you look inside biology and inside your cells, they are packed full of molecules that can absorb light. And when they absorb light, their function, how they transfer electrons, for instance, can change. And this is one of the areas which quantum biology is looking at, for instance, in the tryptophan networks. And tryptophan's an amino acid which absorbs light in UV. And when it does that, it does all sorts of very interesting quantum things. But if it's in a structure like the cytoskeleton, which a lot of it is, that also has some very interesting electrical properties, like does some quantum things like superradiance. So, which of course raises the big question, I think where you're going with this is, of course, if the life, what we think, and it certainly is based on these molecules, does that suggest something else is going on? And one of our whole ethos here, and what we're suggesting, and in having spoken to other people in the field, is, of course, I think people will have heard of biophotons by now, and I think it's important here to provide a definition because it's relevant. Is these are photons which are produced by metabolism, and we have to be very, very careful. And this is what we're discovering is a lot of the literature at the moment out there. They talk about biophotons now. I think people may be familiar with the story of this. It's worth going back through history. There was this chap called Alexander Gurwitch, and again, this is where the link is so important with what we were talking about electricity. At the turn of the 19th century, people were thinking about, well, how is life the shape it is? What makes a finger, a human, a fish, a fish? And we didn't know about DNA. We knew there was inheritance. We knew something was going on, but we didn't, because this was before we discovered, the idea of genes was probably there already, but we didn't quite know what they were made of, or how this inheritance, or what was giving the shape of something. But the electrical field idea the whole idea was already there. And this is this thing called the morphogenetic field. Now, at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, there was this chap called Alexander Gurwitch, and he was looking at this, and he was promoting this idea and thinking. And one of the things he did, and we're not entirely sure why he did it, but he was looking for evidence of some kind of field. And his experiment, which is now very famous, was he took took two onions actually, and separated them with a quartz plate. And what he was looking for was a non-chemical form of communication. And he cut the roots of one onion and showed it, and the comparable onion on the other side of the quartz plate, its roots grew faster, basically induced what we call mitosis, which is cell division. And he called it mitogenetic rays. And what it turned out was this was UV photons. And that led to a huge amount of research, especially by the Russians, trying to discover what this was. And it's been one of those strange fields which people have sort of said, well, is it real? Is it not? And the evidence is that it does appear to be real. Now, the problem we've had with this, and this is something which is like a warning shot in biology and science, you can go off thinking, oh yeah, there's plenty of these photos. And I even thought about this when we set the foundation up. One of the things I was talking to my colleagues at Harwell, they said, can we image a cell using biophotons? In particular, I was thinking, can we image a mitochondrion using them? And as we discovered, the actual production of them is so low, the intensity is so low, it's not possible. What many people are actually seeing is something called delayed luminescence. Now, this is a whole other area of physics, which we're now discovering we really have to dissect. It could be really important, which of course is that I think many people may have heard of this, is, if you shine a light on a material, many materials will do this, turn the light off, then put a light detector, a photomultiplier tube or something, this material will produce photons quite brightly for several hours. And it's acting a bit like a photon battery. And there's all sorts of interesting physics going on. And it decays over sort of 10 or 15 hours. Now, if that's true, any of these early biophoton experiments, if they're exposed to light and then you're trying to measure the photons, what you're largely measuring could be delayed luminescence, not what we call, I said to one of my work colleagues, I said we ought to call them metabolic photons, not biophotons. But anyway, that didn't go down very well. Anyway, that's beside the point. But the experiments we've done and other people are doing now is we have to be absolutely careful to get rid of delayed luminescence. And it does seem to be real. And biology, especially under stress, which I think is very key, does seem to be producing anything between 10 to 100 photons, individual photons, per centimeter squared per second. That is way below anything we can see. And it requires some very sensitive instruments to pick these up. But it does seem to be real, which of course begs the question, which I think is where you're going with this, is what is it doing? Is it just a spurious, interesting side effect of metabolism? But of course, from a quantum aspect, it's predictable. If you've got electrons moving around and they get changed or something happens to them, there is a chance that you can end up producing photons along the way. You use the quanta of energy, and that seems to be something's true. Now, of course, there's a big question, and I think where you're going with this, and this is where I'm going with it. One of the things is if the cell is full of these chromophores, these molecules, particularly electron transport, can absorb these photons, and the cell is producing photons, is this biologically relevant or is it just a nice finding? Well, I would suggest if we talk about dissipation, and it is part of a homeostatic mechanism, because if life is about dissipating energy, anything which is dissipating energy and it can be dissipated faster will be used as a mechanism to maintain the homeostasis or the status of that particular system, call it a cell or life. And this idea that biology has been using these biophotons has been raised many times, as Bock et al., I think, said this a long time ago. They're saying, well, if photons are being produced, there may be a lot more of them inside the cell than outside the cell. And of course, there's a very simple reason for this, is that each of your cells actually is quite well screened against light. You have a membrane, you have other molecules, you have sunscreen molecules, which block this out. Because as we now know, and this is the point about the electron transport chain, and I mentioned this idea of these cytochromes found in cells. They discovered these things called cytochromes sometime in the 1880s, I think it was. But it wasn't until much later that they realized they were actually key part in how we respire, how we get the energy down to from food into oxygen. And they're all part of the electron transport chain. But it was somebody called Britton Chance, amongst others, who's a very famous biochemist, who realized that you could study, and this is the key thing, you could study how the electron transport chain using light. So you can measure, and we do this today. You measure oxygenation in blood using light. You can do this. But what it also does is it tells you information about what the electron transport or the oxidation status of the system is. But equally, if you shine the light on it, it changes it, because what you're doing is inputting energy into the electron transport chain. And this process is very, very sensitive. And this is something you'll see in the literature now talking about mitochondria being receptive for light. They're not the only one. There are plenty of other things in the cell other than mitochondria that do it. But if we study them, you can actually put mitochondria into a cell. You can shine light onto a cell, And this is the key thing of multiple wavelengths. And each wavelength has a slightly different effect on electron transport chain depending on what's absorbing it. But it clearly does alter the flow. And there's a very nice paper by Glinska, I think it is, where they looked at, and there's not many papers out there on this, but surprisingly actually, but where they looked at anything from UV light, blue light, all the way up into the infrared, and showed, as would be predicted, each of the complexes in the electron transport chain are indeed affected by light. And so there's a dose response effect. Low doses seem to, can stimulate potentially metabolism. High doses inhibit, and this is another favourite biological term that again we need to adopt, and certainly medicine needs to adopt, is this idea of hormesis, which is a low stimulus can induce adaptation to resist a larger dose of that stimulus down the road. And the classic example of this is exercising. If we exercise, we have to adapt to be able to run faster, for instance, and that process is hormesis. And we talk about these with polyphenols, for instance. They can, and Paracelsus said this: the dose of something is the poison. Low doses don't poison you, high doses do. But biology, and if you think about this from natural selection, has to adapt to what goes around it. It either dies or it adapts. Live or die, adapt or die. And as I said earlier, this process is happening right from the molecular all the way up to whole species. Large, big events like asteroids hitting the Earth wiped out the dinosaurs, but small things like changes in the climate, things can cause adaptation. And so when we think about these things, we have to think about it from that perspective. So what this suggests, and this is kind of what I'm writing about at the moment, is, of course, early life, if it wasn't observed too much light, could survive. But as it evolved and it moved, say, closer to the sunlight, it might actually have to develop sunscreens. And this is the fundamental process we think goes on with land plants. Now, of course, photosynthesis, another story, may have evolved very early in life, much earlier than people realized, maybe in a thermal vent, again. But as that life slowly evolved and naturally got stronger and stronger and got more adaptive, it got closer and closer to the surface. And we now know that land plants, because at some point, these little bacteria, these photosynthesizing bacteria, eventually evolved into plants. When they got onto the surface of the Earth, of course, they're exposed to huge amounts, far more light than they would ever have been exposed to, deep down in the sea. And therefore, they had to develop all of these ways of basically resisting the huge amount of energy coming from the sun. And the best theory at the moment, and this is going back to our early research, was looking at why is it compounds in plants act as medicines. Now, this is, we all know about phenols. A lot of the medicines that we now use are developed from plant compounds. And the thinking is that certainly what they call polyphenols or phenolic compounds, but there are other things like alkaloids too, are originated as sunscreen molecules to help the plant survive in difficult conditions, i.e. they dissipate the solar potential, say to heat or something, or indeed through chemistry. They change shape and form, and they follow a catalytic cascade of chemistry. But through time, those single molecules, of course, become involved in all sorts of stress resistance. So when we look at plants now, we've got things like resveratrol, I'm sure you've heard of, curcumin, the tumerones and things like these. And there's loads of these compounds, berberine, all the ones you see in, people talk about as being health things. And most of them interact with mitochondria. All of them can act as sunscreens because they can absorb UV light or even slightly longer wavelengths of their bigger molecules. But they also can act as antioxidants and even pro-oxidants, which raises a really interesting question. These things started out perhaps in one purpose, but as life got more complicated, that particular function got adopted and used for all sorts of things in stress resistance. And one of the things we suggested in one of our papers, that when you look at things like cannabidiol, for instance, which is found in all THC, tetracannabinol, we all think of those as being, well, this is all to do with wacky backy or something, but it's not. These things evolved to protect the plant. And what's interesting is, of course, they're pleiotropic, or they have multiple functions. And you talk about any of these compounds and you say, well, how does THC work? Well, it binds to receptors in your brain, which gives you the feelings, but it's also affects mitochondrial function. It also is an antioxidant. It dissolves in membranes. It also absorbs light. And it does multiple things. And if you start to think about this from the basis of complexity, it means that the fundamental principle of being able to dissipate energy affects all of these pathways. And therefore, when we go back to our modern cell, back to your point, we now have a cell which has a lot of plants in particular, but humans and our cells, we have lipids, we have all sorts. We've got cholesterol, very good sunscreen. From that, we get all sorts of things like vitamin D and things, but these are all chemical processes. But it blocks light. So internally, and we don't know, and this is something we're thinking about how we can do it, is that if we could look inside a cell, if we're right on this, it will be full of light. Because it's not getting out, it gets absorbed, so it doesn't come outside the cell. And there's plenty of evidence now that that this light is being produced. These biophotons are being produced, but within the cell there may be a lot more of them. And if we're right on this, of course, it could well be a system that cell's using for its homeostasis, but we just can't see it. So if you go to daily life, you can see why when there's less light, but as soon as you get, you and I are sitting here and you have to go outside in the hot weather, you're actually very well protected most of the time against light. There's a good reason for that, because if it got inside of you, it'd mess you up.
I'm glad, thanks for coloring that in. I guess the origin of the question for me was a comment or even perhaps a criticism of Levin's work, but by Dr. Jack Kruse, which was that his research focus is bioelectricity, but the nuance that you've just expounded upon is that it's probably photobioelectricity that is orchestrating or influencing that morphogenic template.
It could be. We just don't know. I mean, the caveat emptor here, we don't know. Now, the evidence is, if you put it all together, life is full of chromophores. We know, and we use the technology all the time to measure this. Therefore, life is, and certainly mitochondria are very sensitive to light. If they are producing photons, and we could prove they're producing a lot more inside the cell than we see outside, nature would not have wasted that. And if it would be a natural process, of part of the dissipation process. And I said, and this is the shift in thinking, which I think is really important. Now, I could be completely wrong on this, but my sense is if the physics is right on self-organization, then dissipation is at the core of all of this, which means anything that dissipates energy and therefore, as Schrodinger would have said, exhibits negative entropy, i.e. you're exporting entropy to maintain structure. And I can't go to the maths in this because I don't fully understand it, but there's some very clever people who talked about this. Then anything in the cell which is dissipating, shifting energy around, is part of that structural process. And if photons are moving around, that would be an entirely plausible mechanism for doing it. We have to prove it. Now, we're trying it, other groups are trying it, and Mikkel Sifras and other groups are trying to show it, but we are getting progress on this. We've had to build some incredibly careful equipment to get rid of the delayed luminescence, to see, can we really see it? And the answer is we can. We've published a paper saying that we think we've seen non-chemical communication between mitochondria, which is an old Russian experiment, which we repeated, does seem to be real. We need more data, but it does seem to be real. And if it is real, then this idea that inside the cells is more light going on than we realize. As to Mike Levine's work in the bioelectricity, again, it seems fairly obvious to me. And I've had this conversation with Mike about this because he's very interested in the external field more than anything in terms of, looking at wound healing. My thoughts, well, have you linked, we need to link that to mitochondria because, of course, internally, there's huge electric fields going on. And this goes back to some very old ideas around how mitochondria and the cytoskeleton interact, Froelic's ideas and what they call condensates and the lowest energy state. But if this is true, and we are producing these photons and they're interacting with electric states in the cell, which no reason why they shouldn't, this does mean that we have to think a bit more about, as you said, photobioelectricity or something. Now, I keep coming back to the same thing. Life would have evolved ways to protect this. And so the fact that light doesn't change us too much, or electricity doesn't change us too much, says that the system is very well screened. None of the spacecraft, a lot of aircraft would not work if we didn't screen the electrics from external electric magnetic fields. We can buy off the shelf devices which protect cells from the magnetic field, and a lot of instrumentation has to be protected by that because it influences how the instruments work. And biology is no different. We're just very good at it. That's why we can stand under a power wire probably and not fall over. I mean, there may be effects, and that's another whole story. That's another whole
rabbit hole.
Another rabbit hole to go down. But the point is, the fact that we're here talking and actually quite an changing environment suggests how well this system works. And it's taken billions of years to get here, but it's got here, and we're quite resistant actually. So looking inside is actually the key to this, but how we do it. And of course, this goes back to a fundamental principle in quantum mechanics. If you observe it, you change it. And this is where it gets really difficult to start, understanding what we look, it's
I want to change tack to another fundamental aspect of mitochondrial physiology. And at the fourth complex on the electron transport, cytochrome C oxidase, the electron essentially gets accepted by oxygen, and we form water, H2O. And it turns out that there's some unique properties of this water in that it is deuterium depleted. And
is it? Okay, yeah.
there's the Hungarian group, Laszlo Boros and Gabor Somlai,
Yeah.
probably the leaders in looking at how the deuterium to hydrogen ratio in of the water potentially affects cell growth and cellular essentially malignancy and neoplasia. But from Boros's work, it seems like the electron or the electron transport chain of the mitochondrion itself has evolved to select for and a TCA cycle through its cycling of substrates for deuterium depleted or against deuterium to essentially keep deuterium out of the matrix. So, have you, in your work, come across research that is looking into deuterium or potentially how deuterium depleted water, the characteristics of this water is unique in mitochondrial biology?
Okay, I'd have to hold my hand up and say I'm aware of his work. I have to say I'm not fully aware of this idea that it's actually biology is quite specifically deuterium depleting itself, and I'll hold my hand up and say that I'll need to look into that, and I can't make pure comment on that particular aspect of the research. I can comment on the deuterium in general, because this goes back to the understanding that we explore, for instance, the potential quantum effects by using isotopes, things like deuterium. Now, this comes back to something called the kinetic isotopic effect. If you use, if you're moving protons around, or you're using water and you have deuterium, suddenly you start to change the whole potentially quantum structure. And from what I understand, and this is the work I've seen, and I have been in contact with Boros, but I haven't seen this latest stuff yet. So, but you would expect that, again, back to the evolution of life, that it would have evolved to work under whatever was available at the time. And that would have been the isotopic ratios of everything. We know from deuterium that it can have, and we came across this a long time ago when looking at hormesis, is that low doses of deuterium seem to, in some organisms, stimulate reactive oxygen production, which you might predict if there's a quantum tunneling or something going on. And at low levels, that can actually induce adaptation. At high levels, it becomes lethal. And I think that exploration hints that there clearly is something going on, but there's so many of these different isotopes around, and we also talk about calcium isotopes and things as well. This idea that when you're looking at calcium channels, and lithium, particular lithium is another one which people are looking at. As to whether biology to selectively removes it or changes it, as you're suggesting, as I feel I can't comment on that because I just haven't looked at the research in detail enough to answer that question. But I would completely expect that, and this has been shown when we're looking at, for instance, enzyme reactions. If you change deuterium, certainly if you change some of the other isotopes, you do change chemical reactions. And the only real explanation for that is a tunneling effect. So yeah, and that would make perfect sense to me because, of course, the ability to tunnel is totally dependent on mass and velocity. So how fast a molecule's moving and how heavy it is. The bigger it is, the less it tunnels. So electrons tunnel quite well. Protons, to a certain degree, heavier stuff, less so. And if you get too big, it doesn't do it at all, or the chances of it are much smaller. So
well, that's what Boros's work is suggesting, is that the kinetic isotope effect means that you, compared to other atoms, essentially the hydrogen versus deuterium is almost like 100%, because you're adding on whole neutrons. So you're doubling essentially the atomic mass
Yes, yeah, yeah.
relative to the proteum. So that in and of itself seems to be significant in the essential turning of the turbine, the ATPase.
Yes, yes. I mean, yeah. No, that's on. Yeah,
So
because
you're potentially wrecking more of these ATPases, and you're
yes,
forcing the organism to manufacture more of them, to replace more of them, and that seems to be significant biologically when we're talking about.
yes. Because I mean, I think the problem with deuterium is it's not selective. Any process where you have protons moving around, you are going to affect. It's not just the ATPase. It'll be going through membranes. It'll be going between different enzymes. Because every time you move an electron, you generally move a proton, and they all couple together. And this is one of the processes that's going on all the time. And certainly, when you look at how protons, electrons, they're the energies precipitated to push the proton across would be affected. You would argue if you suddenly increase the mass of the proton, it's going to do something. And I think it's a bit of a sledgehammer. It's fundamental change in the entire system and pinning down which bit's most important. And it probably there will be, as he suggests, maybe that the ATPase would be quite sensitive to this. But of course, all that would mean is that process was more sensitive. Other processes in the cell, like anaerobic glycolysis or something, would kick in. So, the cell's actually very adaptable to that. But certainly we know if you go, there is a dose effect and it could well be hormetic. So small doses, yeah, it damages something. The cell goes, that's not working. I've got reactive oxygen being produced here. Right, I'll upregulate the game. I'll get rid of the old damaged ones and put some new ones in. And that's how the process works. And up to extent, it can modify. And actually, in some respects, it makes it stronger, but only so far. Hormesis says that only about, the improvement's about 20%. It seems to be pretty much as Ed Calabrese makes his point about all these various factors. But the pathways are common. If the cell is stressed, it'll upregulate, and often it's the mitochondria, it senses the stress, and it'll send signals back to the nucleus, for instance, in retrograde signaling, to produce more mitochondria or something, which will help the cell survive whatever it's being stressed with. And that's where natural selection comes in, because if that process can't work, that system then fails, gets removed, and another system which can adapt survives. That's to me, it makes perfect sense. I think Darwin would have got this. I'd love to have a conversation with him about it. I'm sure he would have got it.
The clinical corollary with respect to deuterium, from my point of view and from reading the Hungarian's work, is that if the mitochondrial colony is broken or they're damaged in the condition of malignancy, cancer is established, then potentially deuterium depleting the body by exogenous consumption of deuterium depleted water or consumption of food substrates that preferentially generate more deuterium depleted water through mitochondrial metabolism could be advantageous in preventing further growth of malignant cells.
It's interesting. I completely get where that's coming from. Now, this raises a really interesting question. I mean, if you don't want to go down this route, but of course, what is cancer? And what's interesting here, and this is something, again, ever since Warburg's idea, aerobic glycolysis and everything, it was thought for a long time that mitochondria are damaged in cancer. There's something going on and they're damaged and they don't work properly. What I've read and seems to suggest, and it makes more sense to me, is that simply there is some other programming going on where the cell reprograms itself. And what we now know is that mitochondria aren't dysfunctional at all in most cancers. They've just been reprogrammed to help the cancer. And one of the classic examples of this, and I was reading up on this yesterday, actually, because we're writing a paper at the moment on this, is that if you view it from that perspective, and this is that if you reprogram mitochondria, now in cancer, many cancers, they exhibit, this is where the terminology gets a bit weird and a bit difficult. They say, they experience oxidative stress, and this is behind the idea that, you can treat with other agents which kill the cancer. But of course, and this takes you right back to Harman's theory, free radical theory of aging, etc. And it's just this idea that mitochondria simply, they produce ROS as a byproduct, and it's an unwanted byproduct. It couldn't be further from the truth. Mitochondria are exceptionally good at managing their oxidative stress. and what we call redox, which is redox reduction. And they manage it very tightly for a very good reason. It's a signal. If we go all the way back to electrons being fundamental to life, management of that electron flow is part of the homeostatic dissipation system. And therefore, what we do know, and this is very well described, is that, of course, proliferating cells slightly modify their redox environment. And you call it slight increase in free radical production, stimulates growth. Too little, too much kills them, not enough and they don't grow. And we know this, and clearly one of the organelles is the mitochondria, which is important, but it's not the only one. There's there's other nitrose oxidase things involved in this. So if we look at it from that perspective, you can say, well, actually, it's not the fact that the mitochondria is damaged. It's simply reprogrammed as part of what appears to be a process where the cell is then trying to say, I'm going to adapt to do something different. And this is the fundamental question, I think, in cancer, is exactly what is it? We know it can precipitate it, and if you damage things with oxidative stress, they do change, but it's part of an adaptive process. And it's a very old process. And the question is why does it happen? And I think this is a $1 billion question. Now, whether or not putting something like deuterium, which is effectively a toxin, into something can help. And I think in some circumstances it clearly does. We have chemotherapy. A lot of the old chemotherapy, and I know well because I've had cancer and I've had chemo, it's just toxic. Fortunately, healthy cells survive it better than the ones which are on the edge, like cancer cells. But it doesn't always work. And it then breeds a new type of cancer cell. I think we know this. But what's changing, and I think, is understanding how this process goes. And if you think about the mitochondria simply adapting, it's a different story. It still raises the question as to what cancer actually is, but it's, and and certainly we know that that there are quite specific mitochondrial changes, and it's.
I mean, go on.
No, I was just going to say, but it comes to a point, maybe, about how you modify the mitochondrial function. And what's interesting, I mean, I've only found one paper on this. Everybody talks about cancer being like a genetic disease, but there is evidence. If you push the metabolism in a certain direction, you induce like a cancer type of phenotype. So it's not genetic as such. And this, of course, goes back to the work of looking at what Mike Levine's doing of bioelectricity and templates and where the information is held and why it changes and why a cell suddenly decides. Because one of the theories that Mike makes and quite a few people make is that what actually cancer represents is the lack of cooperativity. Cells stop cooperating. And it's not a defect in the sense that it's damaged. It's just they decide to stop cooperating for some reason. Now, why that is a really big question.
Well, I think this detour it's a fruitful detour because what you're implying is, and what I've read as well, is that this idea that it's an atavistic regression into a more de-differentiated state, which to me, the obvious answer is that it's in response to the environmental conditions which that person is putting themselves in. And to clarify, the use of deuterium depleted water is not adding deuterium for a hormetic benefit. It's inducing deuterium depletion to reduce the rate or the load of potential ATPase disrupting deuterium atoms in the system. And I mean, that's another whole topic, and as it relates to oncological research.
No, you're right on the atavistic idea, and it seems to me that to me makes more sense because I mean that again, this is nothing makes sense. Tabansky said this, nothing in life makes sense apart from in evolution. And if you go back to this, why would a bunch of cells suddenly decide to stop cooperating and go wandering off? Which is what they do. They start growing faster. And when they metastasize, their function completely changes. And this is really interesting. They suddenly become much better at managing reactive oxygen, and then they wander off through the body. And then they go and plant somewhere else, and they go and find a niche. Isn't that reflective of something going on in history? Isn't that reflective of very early biology? You're on. Look, here's a scenario, and this is if you're a cancer cell. Why are you doing it? Well, are you just reinitiating a program that happened 4 billion years ago when you had to start moving away from a thermal vent? Whatever reason, that system has suddenly been activated, and there could be any number of reasons why it happens. But fundamentally, you're getting this highly coordinated program that makes you very unsocial. in a multicellular organism. One of the interesting things, and we mentioned earlier, is if you think about these idea of these stromatolites and these, and archaean bacteria cooperating for billions of years before complex life came along, there was probably circumstances when, it was far better to cooperate most of the time, but every now and then it was every man for himself, and that could have been a change in the environment. And so when you look at cancer treatment, and this is something Mike Levine talks about, and indeed other people, Brzezinski and others have talked about the electric field, but you see this change in the electric field in cells, and this is a whole other story to go into. But the point they're making, and Mike always makes, is of course it sounds like the cells are just suddenly stopping to cooperating. Now, does that mean we can teach them how to reprogram to reintegrate? Which of course is maybe a holy grail of cancer treatment, and I think if we start going back through evolution, this starts to make more sense to me. How we do it is, of course, the billion-dollar question, but understanding a fundamental principle, might actually help us start to go in the right direction. And trying to club a cancer to death with high levels of chemotherapy isn't always going to work.
No, you've reminded a piece of research that popped into my head, which is the effect of the vitamin D system on cell to cell adherence.
Oh,
And
yes,
it just so happens that vitamin D signaling increases cell to cell adherence, and the degree to which epithelial cells particularly adhere to each other, so in the skin and the gut. And it's also interesting that vitamin D acts as to reduce cell proliferation. That's what it does in the skin, and so much so that calcipotriol is a purified vitamin D analog secosteroid, and it's used as a topical treatment in psoriasis. So it's interesting how ultraviolet light, which is generating these secosteroids, is having a profound suppressive effect on cell replication, increasing cell adherence, and seems to be inversely associated from a clinical and epidemiological point of view, with not only cancer incidence, but also cancer prognosis in those who have already been diagnosed.
And you come into a whole different era. But again, I'm thinking, but of course, the vitamin D story is a really interesting one. I mean, we on our light series we did recently, we had the work of Richard Weller, and I think this segues very clear, very well into this. Of course, both melatonin and vitamin D modulate and are modulated by mitochondria. You've got to understand this. And of course, how's vitamin D made? It's a light-induced cascade. It's a dissipative process. When you look at how the various molecules end up, and it's the same with the kallikreinin system and all sorts of things going on, you actually see a whole like a autocatalytic cascade induced by energy input. And so what's vitamin D? And what's cholesterol? It's a sunscreen. But then you induce chemistry, which then has a profound remote effect right throughout the body. And I think that tells us something really important, I think, and as you said, this idea that it modulates things. Because I don't know if you're going to talk about this today, and we want to talk about it, but it's the idea of the role of vitamin D, the role of nitric oxide, roles of all these other things, and the role of UV light in particular, I think is absolutely fascinating, and it's opening a whole window into something we need to be thinking about when we start thinking about light therapy. I don't know if we're going to go into that today, but of course the light thing does come into this in a big way.
Yeah, well, I think you just triggered a thought when we're talking about atavism and malignancy and cancer as a response to environmental conditions. And I guess I'm piecing together the puzzle, and it seems to me that could be a UV light deficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we the series we've just done, I think you mentioned it. This idea, and this is where the light, understanding the origins of the light interaction with biology and its role in biology comes in. And as we said, if we look at the molecules in the cell, including water itself, which absorb light, it goes right across from the UV all the way deep into the infrared. All of those things can have an effect on biology. QED biology is how to adapt to use these things in a way which helps it survive. And the vitamin D story, or not the vitamin D story, but the nitric oxide story, and certainly other things are really, really important. Because of course, you talk about vitamin D. And then one of the things that actually, this is the Richard Weller's focus is this idea that we need some UV light to survive. And of course, this is the melanin story. This is the out of Africa story. Why is it? And this is the point that Richard made really, really well. And I hadn't really thought about it until he made it in his talk. He was saying, look, we came out of Africa. We were all dark skinned. We had lots of melanin. Why? Because we evolved under a lot of high sun. As we moved further north, there was this requirement there was a strong selective pressure to reduce the amount of melanin in our skin. Why is that? Now, some would say, oh, it's just about vitamin D. Well, it's not the entire story by a long shot. And the evidence is now that when we shine UV on the skin, it reduces all sorts of things which seem to enhance our survival, as long as it's not too much of it. And this comes back to the hormetic principle. The right amount is good, too much is bad. We live in a society where everything's linear, more is better, or more is more dangerous. There's no Goldilocks zone. We just don't accept that. And I think this, when we look at the story of, this is what Richard Weller showed was that, well, he didn't, but there's lots of studies, and he made the point. Survival, and this is the Scandinavian study, which I found fascinating, is where they looked at thousands of people in Scandinavia, and they looked at their sun exposure. And there's been recent studies actually being done on sunbeds too, but I'll go into those just as well. But make the point that actually, if you look at overall survival of large populations, those people who are exposed to sunlight, especially in more northern latitudes or southern latitudes, live longer. Now, yes, they do seem to have a higher rate of melanoma, but that at a population level, and this is where statistics and understanding statistics comes in. If you look at thousands of people, yes, few will get melanoma, but the majority will live longer because their blood pressure drops and they have better immune systems. And this is borne out during COVID. And this data seems to be coming from COVID. So when we think about individual components, and unfortunately, society and scientists and biologists and everybody to some degree gets fixated on one particular thing. It's all about vitamin D. Well, the answer is maybe no, it isn't. It's part of the story, but we have to look at the bigger picture. And and I think this the point that Richard Weller made was, why did we lose that melanin so quickly when we moved north? And it happened very recently, and this is the evidence. It didn't, it wasn't over hundreds of thousands of years. Our ancestors may have been dark skinned recently as 10 to 20,000 years ago, which in evolution terms is nothing. And you think if that's real, I'm not a specialist in this area, but it makes sense. And what's happened is, of course, as humans, with our species, whichever species you think came out of Africa, we moved out of Africa, and there were several migrations, but generally we moved out of Africa, and then we spread upwards into the colder regions, and then around the Earth, and came back down again. And so we've got populations of people who probably started out as dark skinned, got light skinned, and came back down again. I don't know. Does that tell us something? And there's a whole area here, and we now know that, of course, UV light's doing this, but of course, then there's the infrared light story, which I think you're going to the water story in ATPase. There's a whole other story here, which, I don't know if we've got time to talk about it, but of course, makes the point that, we block out most of the UV, but when you look at the absorbent profile of melanin, it blocks UV very well, but it blocks about 40% of the infrared. Why is that? 60%, 50% of sunlight's infrared. So why is it specifically blocking out UV, but allowing, infrared light penetrates right into the body? And we've got, apart from sitting by an iron furnace or a hot fire for 3 weeks, which actually doesn't do you any good, that amount of light and, the amount of light we receive in sunlight, especially in northern latitude, seems to be very important. And it's not just the UV.
The point about sunlight exposure and all-cause mortality, you're referring to Peli Lindqvist's work with the melanoma in southern Sweden cohort, and they basically were assessing sun exposure habits and demonstrated quite an elegant dose response in the sun exposure or sun-seeking behavior of the women who sought the most sun versus the least. And as you mentioned, they basically had lower all-cause mortality despite a higher incidence of skin cancer. And in the women who developed skin cancer, those with the greater sun-seeking behavior had between 1 and 4, but more than that, but between 8 and 4 times odds greater survival. Again, a dose response. So conditional upon getting skin cancer, you were still better off on an all-cause mortality.
Yes, I think that was the message. And the question is as Richard Weller was saying, this is not what dermatologists always like to hear. But again, Do we need more science to prove this? I don't know. Maybe we do. I don't.
I don't think we necessarily do. I think we need a check. Well, it would help, but again, another corollary of this is how the messages are being conveyed to people of different skin color. And I think, I
Yeah.
don't know about what you think about this, Alistair, but it's my personal opinion that a large proportion of the health disparity that you see in potentially African Americans in northern latitude USA, potentially Australian Aboriginal people here in modern Australia, is or underlies or is attributable to the fact that these people are not getting a massive UV light
Yes.
need or outdoor light need being met, and there's cascading negative effects on cancer, on metabolic disease, on cardiometabolic outcomes.
Yeah. No. I think I agree. I agree with this. We've. No, I mean, to be fair, the data came out and everything, but as someone pointed out, it's certainly in the UK. I mean, when you look at the solar insolation and intensity of light, most of the time, most of the damage, skin stuff damage anyway, is basically done around the month, just around midsummer. And rest of the year, we probably don't, most people will not get really enough unless they get severely burnt to really do them damage, but they might get a lot of good about it. But of course, a lot of and this is something that has been made by several people now, and I think Roger Sehel's also said this, is if you look at the legislation, it said slip, slap, slop, put on loads of sunscreen. Don't know what colour you are, put it on. But of course, that's based, and I guess a lot of this is based on the Australian experience, where you have immensely high UV indexes some of the time. In the UK, like today, we're getting none of this. And the point's been made, absolutely, as you said, should Afro Americans be putting it on their kids, in August or September in England? Probably not. They don't need it. Even most light coloured people probably don't need it. And I think, but this is this. How do you get this messaging across, and how do we, build it into a safe way of doing it? Which, because there's always going to be the extreme. Oh, I don't wear any at all, and then you go down to Australia and don't have any sun cream on at all, and of course you get burnt to a crisp. Humans aren't always sensible like that.
Richard Weller's most recent publication again is trying to grapple with the idea of what is the formulation, the risk versus benefit profile in terms of all-cause mortality, skin cancer mortality versus the benefits on cardiovascular and all-cause mortality, and it's again in favor of more sun seeking. So I guess the million-dollar question is, like you have looked into space health, is this argumentum in extremis to prove out a point? I would like to know, in a pale European cohort who live in a massive UV index area of Australia, is it still better to have higher UV exposure for overall health? And pops to my mind a patient I saw about a month ago whose coronary artery calcium score is in the 3,600. So he's got, and this was 5 years ago, he's got an enormous burden of coronary artery calcium, extremely high risk for having cardiovascular event. Yet he's fine. He's completely asymptomatic of chest pain or any other angina symptoms. He went to a dentist and a couple of years prior, and the dentist was doing some dental work. This guy is always in the sun. He's surfing, he's outside, he's mowing, he doesn't have a shirt on. The dentist said to him he has the second hardest dentition that dentist had ever seen. This guy's serum,
Yeah.
this guy's serum 25 hydroxyvitamin D level is 115. So it's my personal opinion that, and then we can discuss the mechanisms but I think he's essentially, endothelium is being stabilized and his cardiovascular system is essentially being protected from a potentially acute event because of his solar exposure.
That's that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I would concur that we need to expose the sun more. I mean, funny enough, I gave you can probably see from the picture behind me. I'm a glider pilot, and that's why people like going. But the point about that is we spend a lot of time outside, and actually, very few people I know, in fact, none of them, have really ever got burnt. Now, okay, we're in England, which is not quite the same as flying in Australia, because especially in the hot sun. But it raises the point, are we getting a real health benefit? But the question is how do you test for this? How do you set up trials? And you're suggesting, because I mean, I think what is known, and this is, of course, this is again, this is the flip side to the coin. Is it's also very well known. There's plenty of people in the cosmetics industry will argue, and certainly the underlying science would argue that infrared light, while it's very important, too much is a bad thing, and it can cause collagen damage and things like that. So there is always going to be this, and I'm sure we've seen people who've been out in the sun. They tend to age their skin can age quite fast. Now the question is that reflective of their internal stuff, or is it they look a bit like a leather handbag, but actually internally they're quite healthy because they've been in the sun?
And that is exactly my suspicion, because I see a lot of patients who come in with great skin, but they've got an autoimmune disease, grumbling in the
Yes, yeah,
in the background. Whereas you do see, I've got another patient. She's about to turn 80. No, maybe a bit of mild insulin resistance now, and lots of non-melanoma skin cancers and solar keratoses that have cropped up, but no dementia, no heart failure, no atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So the biggest killers of society, or the health of her most mitochondrial dense tissues, is intact.
yes,
And that is the trade-off that I personally think people need to accept, which is maybe you do need to accept some degree of photoaging in fair-skinned people who live in Australia. But the trade-off is preservation of the health of the organs that essentially keep you alive.
Well, this takes us to a really, this takes us to a really interesting point, because, and this is coming out from the aging things, because we're obviously very much into the aging thing too. And this is the idea that, organs age at different rates. And this is something which and is measurable now. It is measurable. We can do this. There are various techniques we can do to measure it. And I work with a group who's looking into this. And so, of course, we have, I've always thought, and I don't know how much truth there is, but humans in particular, but many animals are actually quite good at gauging age. We have to be, because, if you go back through evolution, trying to have children, if you're both extremely old, is probably not a good idea. But that's often correlated with fitness. If you're fit and healthy, then the question is how much of that process, is important in how we select mates. Now, people say it's different, obviously, in a modern society, but you go back 30 or 40,000 years, you need to, and probably right back through time, you're always going to select, or trying to select. And I've had this argument with some of my colleagues. So I think we're quite good at assessing aging. The question is, what cues are we using? Is it just the skin, or other cues are we using to assess age? The cosmetics industry is saying, well, is that something which we are reliant on? But as you say, if you've got somebody, has slightly more wrinkly skin, is obviously aged their skin and everything. And because the cosmetics industry said, well, that's a really bad thing, therefore you've got to have all these cosmetics and everything. But actually, many of these people are actually probably healthier than somebody isn't. So how do we assess that as being a real thing, or is it something human induced because of the cosmetics industry or something? I don't know. Certainly there is a fate. Looking good is important. And everybody accepts that. But how far does that go?
And obviously, there's lots of reasons other than light to induce physical aging of the skin. Predominantly smoking, oxidative stress, circadian rhythm disruption. These are all going to induce aging of the collagen degradation and aging of the skin. So let's not suggest that solar exposure is the only factor at play there.
No. And I think that's a really important to make. And this is something that, we're investigating some various groups about. We're looking at the light thing in particular. But something I always emphasize is that, we've talked about this briefly before, is that health, if we go back to our Goldilocks zone again, it seems to be, we talk about vitamins, we can survive without vitamins for a bit, but we don't be very healthy. Light, I think, is the same thing. There's a paper out called Biophotons, making the point. It's about, there is a dependency on the light for importance. But we have to consider other things in this as being optimal. Evidence is that any exercise is good. We have to move. We have to, because that helps generate healthy mitochondria. How far that has to go, and there's a paper came out yesterday debating this. That any movement is important, but how much gives you the best optimal health? And evidence is it's between 400 to 500 minutes per week, of moderate to vigorous exercise. So it's quite a lot. And when you consider that 60-70% of many populations don't do anything at all, then, as you said, you have to say, okay, it's all very well looking after your skin, But if you eat the wrong things, smoke, and don't exercise, it's not really relevant. You've got bigger problems, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
And so, then this comes back to something we've been talking about the dose of what you need. So, for instance, this infrared light story, which I'm sure everybody's pretty aware of now, the red light theory, the mitochondria, all this kind of thing. But of course, how important that is going to depend on your fundamental health to begin with, and how we measure that health. Now, if you're a super fit athlete and you live off oats and eat all the right things, is your dependency on light going to be as important as somebody who's basically lives in the basement of a city, fully polluted, playing games all day? He never goes out in the light and lives off pizza. There's going to be a difference there somewhere. And this is the point we make about in the space. There may be a priority of things we have to consider here, and one of them, maybe the strongest one, may be the importance of exercise. But then you have to load on, okay, well, what about light? What about the diet? Where's the diet? Is it too much of something, too little of something is important? And I think as a society, we still haven't quite managed that yet. And this is the point. I work for we call it the Research Centre for Optimal Health. We still have not defined what health is, really. We define what disease is, but what is, if you see a patient, what would you define as a healthy patient? Is it somebody who doesn't look ill, but have you looked at their internal fat? What's their biological age? Can they run 2 miles? Can they do a chin up? Can they do a sit up? Are they eating phenols? Where do you draw the line? And I think
it's a really good segue into the metabolic syndrome and metabolic dysfunction, and it actually ties into this question you're asking about appearance. And Dr. Sean O'Mara, who I've interviewed a while, he's focuses a lot on visceral fat and obviously these ectopic fat depots, which seem to have the most robust. The evidence is just piles of how the presence of visceral fat or ectopic fat depots correlates to any and all outcomes. You're more visceral fat, the worse prognosis of prostate cancer, ovarian cancer. Ectopic fat in the spine, you're more likely to get the worst osteoporotic cross fractures, et cetera, et cetera. But the point that Dr. O'Mara makes, which I think is fascinating, is that there are perceivably visible changes that occur to the face and the body that signal visceral fat. Key ones are a Frank's sign. So this horizontal crease is a clinical sign. It's basically a diagonal crease on the earlobe, and it correlates to facial depots of visceral fat, and historically was noted in people that were having acute myocardial infarction or heart attack.
I didn't know that.
Look at it's an old Frank sign. The nose size. So this idea that with age, we're taught in medical school and general practice school, your patients' prostates and noses will always grow, and this is just supposed to be a fact of life. But realistically, the nose seems to be growing again because of the pro-inflammatory effect of facial depots of ectopic fat. So the tribe, I think, in our tribal past, that was quickly viewed and noticeable by a woman or by a partner to be able to notice that person's got ectopic fat, that person's insulin resistant or becoming pre-diabetic. So, which is
I completely, because I think that this correlates. We talk about the metabolic syndrome. And I think the other factor here. I love this subject, and it's quite controversial, but it makes the point. You talk about the facial features, but it's symmetry. We know about symmetry. There's a genetic component to this, but actually the epigenetic lived life effect. And you talk about the face, and I think you're right. There's certainly something in that. But I also think, and I think we're very good at looking at movement. And I think we understand. If someone's stooped and hobbling, it's not as good, or they're mentally not as quick, or something. All of these things I do think play into it. And of course, if we're talking about back to the mitochondria and the metabolic syndrome, which is dysfunctional. But of course, the big finding now, and this is something which is absolutely fascinating, but again, pretty predictable, is that, we talk about, for instance, that muscles, if you exercise them, they release all these cytokines, myokines as they call them, which influence the rest of the body. Now, if you think about it, if you have to exercise and run around, everything in the body has to be working better. Your liver has to be able to metabolize better. Your brain has to coordinate everything much better. The muscles have to work better. The whole system has to work much better. So therefore, how does the muscle? There's certainly a feedback through the proprioception system, But we now know that there's all sorts of things like these myokines, these hormones, things like extracellular vesicles. But the other thing that's now coming clear, and this paper came out the other week, is that muscles release mitochondria. They flow around the body, and we now know that cells swap mitochondria. They're a bit like tokens. And one of the things we've discovered, I'm saying raw, we have some very clever people that, but have shown that cancer cells, for instance, can reprogram the tissues around them by swapping mitochondria. So this process is going on all the time. And there's this idea about mitochondrial transplant and, as being really important. And in fact, we do it within ourselves all the time. And so if we have a strong, healthy population of mitochondria, it can affect everything in the body, including your visceral adipose tissue and other fat depots that you don't normally have. And you get the pallor in the skin. You don't resist, for instance, if you exercise. Is the possibility here that you have lots of healthy mitochondria even within the skin? So if you're exposed to various other insults, actually you'll deal better with it, so your skin doesn't age as fast. There's all these other factors need to come into it, and I think at the moment medicine doesn't always see this holistically. And if we think about that, and this is why this from what you're saying, it's fascinating with the ear thing you're saying and the face. I think is absolutely it's true. We know we can look at people who, and my wife says it all the time. You look at some people at the same age. I mean, I'm 64 now. I'm not spring chicken anymore, but there are people I know who are in 50s who look 10, 15 years older than me. Equal people my age who look younger than me. I mean, I'm saying, but the point is that there is obviously something else going on, which we haven't quite plugged into yet or understand, I think.
Well, the other fascinating thing working clinically is that you see this differential effect of organ aging, or you could say organ dysfunction, because each individual manifests the metabolic syndrome in a different way.
Yes.
You can have you have people who, again, they have vastly different personal fat thresholds. So some will simply just keep piling energy into subcutaneous fat and remain metabolically healthy.
Yes. Yeah.
And obviously others will lay down a small amount of abdominal fat and become floridly type 2 diabetic. I talked to another patient recently, and he had a habit of, for various reasons, of eating nocturnally. Essentially, he would eat his dinner at 12, 1 a.m. Every night. And he's done that for the past 20 years. And he wasn't in contact with medical care and found out pretty late that he had hypertensive chronic kidney disease and his, got stage 4 kidney dysfunction. So if you looked at his CT scan, which I did opportunistically, I could see the bottom. I could actually scroll down to he had a chest CT done for another reason. You can see the kidney is surrounded by perirenal adipose tissue, like visceral fat. So it's my opinion that this gentleman obviously also had a high carbohydrate diet. He had processed food diet. His individual way of manifesting the metabolic syndrome was renal, and he had particularly susceptible kidneys to developing chronic kidney disease or hypertensive kidney disease, but remained non-diabetic.
No, I mean, I think this is, the group I work with, Professor Jimmy Bell and Professor Louise Thomas, they've been foremost in developing a lot of the techniques of MRI for studying this, and certainly, a lot of their data and the way they do things, well, their colleagues has gone into the biobank, UK biobank measurements, and actually, as you say, the very first thing you notice about all of this, and I've been scanned myself, and look at me as well. But is this just changing internal fat? And of course, it was the group that came up with this fat outside, thin inside idea, which is the FOTI. And I came up with the TOFI, which is the thin outside, fat inside. And this is exactly what you're saying. And I think the thing that many people, and this is where the BMI starts to be a very bad metric a lot of the time, because I know they're trying to change it now. But of course, one of the things they found a long time ago is you can have people walking around on the outside, depending on how you view it, and on many characteristics, medical criteria, I look perfectly healthy. They've got a BMI of 23, 24. They're apparently healthy. But you go inside them, and they are very unhealthy. They've got huge amounts of visceral fat. They've got fat inside the liver. They've got fat in the liver. Fat, obviously, is one of the big things. They've got intramuscular fat, all in the wrong places. And then you can look at somebody, for instance, this is the point that Jimmy Bell makes, and he gives a lot of these lectures. He's on. I think he's online doing some of this. You look at some of these rugby players and people like that, American football players, their BMI is 31, 32. And if you went to a normal health insurance, they wouldn't insure you at all. Yeah, these are people who, even in their 30s are muscular, they can run 10 miles, incredibly strong, very healthy, very fit, yet their BMI is up. And somewhere in society, and I don't know in medicine, this got all mixed up. And this idea, and we've always said that one of the things you look at, if I try and explain it to people, is that one of the simplest ways of looking at this is excess fat is inflammatory, muscle's anti-inflammatory. You've got to get the balance right, and the only way you get the balance right is exercising and having the right diet. And it's actually not particularly rocket science, and this explains why some people are metabolically healthy. And quite often, I mean, you're right, there is genetics here, but a lot of it is just lifestyle. And you can be quite large and actually have quite a lot of fat, but inside you're actually quite healthy.
Yeah, and the nuance here is that it's the distribution of the fat. So
Yeah,
you can be metabolic healthy as long as it's subcutaneous and not visceral.
yeah,
I think the other point about understanding this longevity story is that so many people would benefit just from MRI scanning to identify visceral fat depots and then work backwards to adopt a lifestyle that minimizes for ectopic fat. And that happens to be, in my clinical experience, when you put people back into the metabolic envelope, this ancestral niche that we talked about all the way, at the beginning, then that lifestyle, those practices, that continuous movement. I sent you that tweet of the uncontacted Amazonian tribe in the Peruvian
yes, yeah,
Amazon. You look at these gentlemen; they have no metabolic disease, there's no visceral fat. They are exposed to the 24-hour circadian rhythm. There's no artificial light pollution. They've got local food consumption. They're respecting chrononutrition, and they've got no visceral fat. So circling us all the way back, and I think if you put people in this environment of this ancestral niche, then they'll naturally, one, have low visceral fat, and two, get to that lifespan, which is coordinates with morbidity compression and
yeah,
optimal
yeah,
health.
yeah. I mean, one of the things I've, as being a pilot, but I talk about, we as a pilot have to understand things called flight envelopes, and anybody's pilot will now understand this. So that an aircraft is designed to work within certain parameters, and we have what we call a metabolic flight envelope. And the idea, but what I call it an adaptive metabolic flight envelope, actually, because we evolved in a particular zone, and and our biology has become what you call canalized to function optimally in that area. And for humans, this seems to be that there is a Goldilocks zone of requirement for exercise and everything, and now we have to live within that envelope. Now, to some degree, exercise and the right life can actually expand that envelope a little bit, so we become more adaptable. And the problem is, and there's Jeffrey Guy, who's part of the foundation, who always says a lot of the problems we see in medicine don't occur until we're stressed. We can be like your patient who didn't realize how ill they really were. What would have happened maybe to someone like that is if they were stressed for some reason, like they got a virus or something like that, they would do a lot worse than somebody who wasn't in that position. And I think, we made this suggestion right at the beginning of COVID, was that one of the things that might determine, and with some evidence this is coming out now, is that your mitochondrial health, which is a readout from metabolic health, would determine the likelihood of you being very, very ill. And certainly the evidence seems to suggest this. If you've got a lot of comorbidities, you fall into that faction who would probably have the metabolic syndrome, your ability to resist the virus might not be so good as somebody who is healthy. And of course, the age thing comes into this. And this is one of the statistics I always find fascinating. People who are lifetime athletes, or at least, they've been fit all their lives, they tend to keep their thymus functioning much longer than people who don't. And of course, the thymus, as you know, is very important in T cell control. And so this is back to immunosenescence and control of the immune system. It seems that our systems require this regular stimulus to optimally function until, and as you said, and this is the key thing, there is obviously, humans obviously have a programmed life expectancy. Very few people live beyond 110. But up to that point, there seems to be evidence that you can actually live functionally very well until it all goes wrong at the end, which of course is what you call morbidity, morbidity compression. And what we see in modern populations, and there's some horrendous statistics coming out now. In America, they've just done another assessment of metabolic syndrome, and I think over the 60s, it's 60%. And it's thought 30-40% in the general population, of course. And and there's a paper came out about 5-6 years ago where they actually tried to say, they were looking at metabolic health as best they could, and they worked out that less than 10% of Americans were actually metabolically healthy. That is startlingly scary, because the cost implication is massive. And we know that obesity obviously is very strongly related to this, and it's costing trillions of dollars a year now.
It's huge.
Yeah,
In the space report, you call it an accelerated aging
yeah,
phenotype, and that is when, and maybe we'll have to talk about this next episode, but you have this graph which explains how if you get everything wrong from an environmental point, you deprive a gravitational field, you deprive a magnetic field, you deprive circadian signals, you deprive near infrared light, the mitochondrion falls apart, and essentially you get accelerated aging. I think that's what's happening now because we're simulating an accelerated aging. We're simulating this space
mm,
environment on a lower level
yeah,
by by completely distorting the circadian signals with light at night, by
yeah,
completely being in near infrared, dark indoor daytime environments, by sitting next to not sources of radio frequency and non-native EMF. And again, that's another topic about
yeah,
magnetic fields that are induced by electric fields, like from electricity. But you see it in patients. You see people, my age. You see people in and older in their early 40s, and they're great. They're graying and they're balding well below the level, the age that their fathers were, and that's the best control that we have is what was
yeah, yeah.
their dads, and they're earlier. They're significantly earlier. So to me, that's saying there's some canary in the coal mine of mitochondrial dysfunction. These are consequences or evidence of an accelerated aging phenotype, and we've got a long way to go to actually reverse this if we're going to fix this problem, because we have to change people's behavior with respect to the environment that they're
Yeah, you
in.
see, this is where you see, and it's kind of like quite a good. This is a good sort of full circle thing because, back to this idea is aging adaptive. Now, um, we published a paper a while back, and in it, I tried to suggest. I mean, I may be completely wrong, but if we look at this emergent property of life on the planet as a dissipation process, natural selection will be operating at all scales. So from the molecular all the way up to entire species. And if you change that environment, what's this system going to try and do? It's trying to select for those that work. So could aging in this respect be actually a completely adaptive process? I.e., it's basically saying, look, you're living in the wrong environment. You're not actually functional here anymore. You're not as good as you should be. We need to explore different areas. In as you would in there's a term in physics called exploring phase space. It goes back to quantum stuff, but the system starts to explore what's the better option. And all we're seeing with our society now is we're beginning to explore the better option. And what it's doing is individuals just aren't living as long because it's beginning to say, well, humans aren't doing very well here. Is there something better over here? Because we want to continue this dissipating process to get rid of, to equilibrate the energy in the
Mm,
universe. And it's not working as well. So is that
mm,
part? And again, I don't know if I'm right or wrong on this one because there's also, I mean, there's as many theories as there are people on this. But if I'm right on that one, it's what you're seeing. And this is why we talk about the accelerated aging process. And you put people into the wrong environment, which is what you just talked about. You put them into space, the same thing happens. With the space one, there's a very interesting point, and they were talking about this a bit yesterday on this launch of this new facility. There's a foundation, but of course astronauts, they do age, and they accept it now. They go up there, and we saw Tim Peake, I think he said he aged 20 years in 6 weeks. But when they come back, he said, "Oh no, we that process reverses." But does it? How far? And this is the kind of the thing that really I think really needs to be taken on board because it isn't just the physical manifestations you see. And this is something again which is difficult. It's a difficult thing to approach. But of course, if we're seeing this, one of the natural sequelae of this is your cognition decreases. And so, are we becoming less intelligent in these societies at a global? Everybody's just as a collective, and so we're going into a vicious cycle. you know,
absolutely.
yeah, and the second thing, of course, comes in. This is the epigenetics, and you've probably heard of transgenerational epigenetics. We now know the life you live can be passed on through epigenetics to your children and their children. And
Mm,
so this is the other theory that around what we're seeing with the modern environment is it isn't just the individuals now. We are effectively instilling this in our children and our children's children. So the whole thing is just going like that. It's going because it's just closing in on itself. And we've got to break the spiral. And if what we're seeing, as you make the point, and the reason we got the space document and the paper in Nature is exactly for what the reason we say. We look at the metabolic syndrome, the experiment that's going on the planet at the moment in many developed countries is the same as being. It's a very fast. The version of this in space is an awful lot faster. The question, of course, and we said this in the paper right at the end, is if this is true, even though the astronauts, because I think the problem we have at the moment, well, it's not a problem, but many of the astronauts, or more of the astronauts so far, have been super fit, super healthy people. They're creme de la creme. They're not the average population. And so, yeah, they recover. People like Tim Peake and these others who have been super fit astronauts recover a bit. But how far? And is their epigenetics changed to a point where if they were ever to have children, would that affect them? Now, this is the point we make about, just kind of as an example, if you get into a spacecraft, go to Mars, you spend 2 years going there, what effect? There's going to be an obvious effect on your own health. But when you come back, if you make it back again, what's that going to have on your children and your children's children?
I'm not optimistic at all.
These are questions which really do need to be answered, and I think that we haven't answered them yet, although we may be already through what you're saying with our modern environment. We're already doing it.
That's my hunch. And look, my message to my patients and my audience is recreate your ancestral niche, recreate your metabolic envelope as much as possible, because that is the most consistent and seem to would say Lindy approach to strategy because if we start changing all these inputs, we don't know how the biology will respond, and it's a much more risky approach. So yeah. Any final thoughts, Alistair? Because I think we're coming on to a very long recording.
Well, I mean, I again, I think there's always, we have, as a species, we have the knowledge, and I think the way I see this at the moment is that for some reason society as a whole finds it very difficult to take this on board. And to me, why is this? Is it a collective blindness? Is it just we don't really want to listen to scientists, or is it something very straightforward? We want to live in we said a long time ago this idea called the intelligence paradox, and straightforward intelligence, if we could take to intelligence, and certainly and any species actually to some degree will try and change its environment to make it as comfortable as possible, and that's completely understandable, and this is what we're doing. The downside is, if you look at the greater, bigger picture, of course, this immediately takes away the very things that enable you to be intelligent in the first place. And for some reason, or for deeper reasons, that actually then results in you starting to age faster, which is the very opposite of what you're trying to achieve. The question is, do we have the intelligence and the collective, because they often said that people are intelligent, crowds are not intelligent. Do we have the collective ability to go, okay, let's have a look at this, let's have a look at this, and actually what can we do to change this? And I think there is, how do we change that? Because there's plenty of people, very smart people, know the problems. We've talked about them already. We know the answers, but how do you change that in a societal level? And I still think we haven't answered that question yet. And I think that's the billion-dollar thing. How do we do it?
Yeah. Well, I think we're further along the line in terms of even considering this than a lot of people, especially with respect to mitochondrial origin of disease and some of these fundamental inputs of light, water, and magnetism. So thank you, Alistair, for sharing your vast knowledge. I think people, if they get to the end, and if you're still listening, thank you very much. This is a very, very deep dive, and obviously, if you've listened to this for the first time, check out my previous podcasts where we've explored a lot of these topics and with a lot of the people that you've already referenced. So yeah, looking forward to speaking more to you, Alistair, and to some more of the people, the scientists that are featured on the Guy Foundation seminar series. So yeah, let's keep the conversation going. And
yes,
thanks
do
again.
Look, because we've got the magnetic. We didn't really talk about it a great deal, but we're doing a series on the role of magnetism, magnetic fields, and with some leaders in the field. So, and again, that's relevant to the space research, but also I think it's just fascinating because it gives us an insight to how biology is working, and areas perhaps we never really believed were important, but are turning out to be important.
Yeah,
So,
amazing. I will include the links to the Gaia Foundation YouTube channel in
yeah.
the show notes. So go back to their YouTube. It's an absolute wealth of knowledge and very, very cutting edge, somewhat technical, but very necessary seminars. So yeah, the link will be in the show notes. Great. All right. Thanks, Alistair. Have a great
Okay.
day.
Thank you very much. Yeah.